They opened a coffin. After a dog's bark, what they discovered brought everyone to tears. The morning Noah was born, the sky above St. Augustine Hospital was pale and heavy with clouds, as if the world itself held its breath. Emily lay curled on her side in the hospital bed, her hair damp from sweat and the panic of a birth that had come too early. Machines beeped steadily behind her, but her eyes never left the tiny form swaddled in blue across the room, incubated and fragile. Mark stood behind the glass, his hands balled into fists in the pockets of his scrubs, his face a sculpted contradiction of awe and terror. It wasn't the first time they'd made it to delivery, but it was the first time the baby had cried. A real, sharp, indignant cry, as if Noah himself was furious at being yanked into this cold world before he was ready. Emily never forgot that sound. She would remember it long after the house grew silent again. Noah weighed only 3 pounds, with a fragile skull and translucent eyelids, but he was alive, and to them, that meant everything. It was as if hope had finally walked through their front door and hung its coat by the window. The days that followed were wrapped in soft lullabies and cautious laughter. The walls of their home absorbed each whispered prayer, each midnight feeding, each sigh of disbelief that, after all the loss and grief, they finally had him. But no one held Noah more often than Shadow did, not in arms, of course, but in presence. Shadow had been Mark's companion since the dorm room years, a black German shepherd with quiet eyes and the patience of someone who had waited for decades to be needed. When Emily was on bed rest, Shadow had taken to lying beside her, his heavy frame curled against her calves like a stone guardian. When Noah arrived, Shadow simply transferred his vigil. Every time Emily placed Noah in the crib, Shadow would follow and lie beneath it, silent as breath, ears twitching at every rustle. Sometimes, at night, Emily would wake to find him staring up at the ceiling, eyes alert in the moonlight, like he was listening for something no human could hear. Noah grew slowly, never quite caught up in size or milestones, but always smiling, always watching. He would stretch tiny fingers through the crib slats to touch Shadow's fur, and the dog would lean into the contact like it meant everything. Mark, who spent long shifts at the hospital, would come home to find them that way, Emily dozing in the rocker, Noah babbling, and Shadow stationed beneath the crib, tail thumping softly with peace. They had built something beautiful, even if it was delicate. And then it ended. Noah's fever came on a Tuesday. Emily noticed at first the way his skin was too warm, his cry too strained. Within hours, he was struggling to breathe. They rushed him in, and the moment they entered the ER, everything moved in fast-forward tubes. Wires, white coats, jargon. Mark, caught between father and physician, stood frozen. It was a different wing of the same hospital he worked in, but the fluorescent lights seemed harsher here. Emily held Noah's hand as his body went still beneath the machines. The pediatric intensivist gave her the same gentle nod she had once seen Mark give to strangers. There's nothing else we can do. The silence that followed felt like a vacuum. It wasn't until they took Noah off the machines that Emily made a sound Mark would later hear in dreams, a sound so raw it didn't sound human. She cradled her son as he faded, and Mark stood a few feet away, unable to move, unable to stop time, unable to do anything except sign the paper the nurse handed him. Withdrawal of life support, witness Dr. Mark Halstead. The funeral was small, white lilies, a tiny casket, a piece of Emily's heart lowering into the ground. Still beating. Mark didn't cry. He drove home in silence, holding Emily's hand the whole way. As Shadow pressed against the back seat, his breath heavy and confused. That night, Shadow didn't sleep beneath the crib. He stood in the nursery for hours, unmoving, staring up at the mobile that no longer turned. Then he left the room and lay in the hallway, paws forward, head down. And the next morning, at 6 o'clock sharp, he left the house. Mark assumed it was grief. Emily did too, at first. But Shadow returned that evening, muddy, tired, silent. The next morning, 6 a.m. again, he left. Day after day, he came and went, like clockwork, never barking, never seeking attention. He ignored the food bowl, ignored the toys, ignored even Emily's soft voice. Then, one morning, curiosity trumped grief. Emily followed him. He didn't notice, or perhaps he didn't care. His body moved with the confidence of someone who had walked this path 100 times. Through the backyard, past the overgrown fence, down 2 blocks, across the silent park, then up the gravel slope of Rosewood Cemetery. He walked straight to a specific spot. Noah's grave. Shadow sat, that was all. He sat like a soldier guarding something sacred. Emily stood behind him, wind pushing against her coat, rain just starting to tap the soil. She watched in silence for 10 minutes, then 20, then an hour. Shadow never looked at her, never moved. And when he stood, finally, he did something Emily didn't expect. He began to dig, not wildly, not like a bike looking for a bone, but with a focused, deliberate motion like he knew exactly where to claw. Emily rushed forward, whispering his name. But Shadow didn't stop. His eyes were full of something she had never seen in an animal before: despair. Or was it urgency? She knelt beside the grave. The dirt where Shadow had been digging was softer. Recently disturbed, it hadn't rained in days. Her heart thudded. The grave should have been untouched. She pressed her hand against the mound, feeling the moisture. Something wasn't right. That night, she barely spoke. Mark noticed, but didn't ask. Emily lay awake until 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling fan, her mind a whirlwind of whispers. The next day, she drove to the hospital alone. She told the records clerk she needed a fresh copy of Noah's death certificate. A routine request, she said. But what she received was anything but. The ID number was wrong, or rather it was right, but duplicated. Another infant, same day, same weight, but no name listed, and the timestamp 4 hours missing. No morgue signature, no camera footage. She felt her stomach drop. Emily asked to speak with someone from night shift records. A technician she vaguely remembered from Noah's last night met her in the hallway, pale and fidgeting. "There's not much I could say," he said, eyes darting. But something wasn't right that night. Files went missing. Things got changed. I didn't think it mattered. Until now. He stepped back, looking haunted. "You should look closer." Emily walked out of the hospital into a thunderstorm. She drove home soaked, trembling, but no longer in doubt. That night, she told Mark everything. He didn't believe her at first, thought she was spiraling, until she showed him the death certificate, the duplicate, the missing hours, the disturbed grave. Shadow lay at their feet as they argued. Then he stood, walked to the nursery, lay beneath the empty crib, and stared. The next morning, Emily contacted a lawyer, filed a petition, requested a legal exhumation. The system didn't understand grief, but it understood paperwork. They gave her a date, a time, a grave to open. Shadow waited, quiet, still, focused. He would not let them forget what was buried, or what wasn't. The morning of the exhumation was colder than expected, the kind of sharp air that snuck beneath coats and rattled bones even in early spring. Emily hadn't slept. Mark had tried lying still beside her, breathing carefully like he used to do when Noah was still in her belly, and he didn't want to disturb the quiet, but it didn't matter. Neither of them spoke much during the drive to Rosewood Cemetery. The silence between them wasn't hostile. It was something heavier, the kind of silence made of fear, and maybe, just maybe, hope, too dangerous to name. Shadow rode in the back seat, head raised, alert but not agitated. His presence grounded them. He wasn't anxious or confused. He didn't look at either of them. His eyes were fixed ahead, as if he'd always known this day would come. The grave was already half uncovered when they arrived. A team in dark uniforms worked quickly but respectfully, brushing away soil layer by layer. A small white tent had been set up to shield them from the press already gathering beyond the trees. Emily stepped forward, only when allowed, heart pounding as her eyes locked onto the coffin, tiny, white, exactly as she remembered it. It didn't make sense, she told herself. Maybe grief was making her see patterns where there were none. Maybe the man at the hospital was wrong, or mistaken, or just cruel. But then Shadow moved, no longer behind her. He padded silently up to the coffin and lay down next to it. Not like a dog mourning a master, like a guard returning to a post. Emily clenched Mark's hand. He flinched slightly but didn't let go. The lid was unlatched. Everyone seemed to hold their breath. The moment it lifted, time fractured. There was no body, only a white baby blanket, folded perfectly, untouched, clean, no sign of decay, no sign of anything at all. Just cloth, just a lie. Mark's knees buckled and he sank to the ground, one hand covering his mouth. Emily didn't scream. Her face didn't even change. But her eyes grew dark in a way that terrified even Shadow. For a long time, no one moved. The lead investigator barked something about protocol, evidence, contamination. But it was background noise to Emily, who stood like a statue carved from disbelief. The next 48 hours blurred. Police took over the house. Interviews, flashing lights, endless calls. The media camped outside. Neighbors whispered behind drawn curtains. But Emily didn't care. Her mind had latched onto one thing: Ellen Voss, the nurse who signed off on the body transfer, who was on duty when Noah died, who hadn't shown up for work since 3 days after the funeral. She ran, Emily told Mark, gripping her coffee cup like a weapon. She ran because she knows. Mark rubbed his eyes. Or because she's terrified of being blamed. Because she did something. Mark didn't answer. Couldn't. Because somewhere deep inside, he was beginning to believe it too. Shadow never left the front door that night. He lay there for hours, unmoving, waiting. 2 days later, police found Ellen. A gas station clerk recognized her from a missing persons bulletin. She was living under a fake name in a rented farmhouse 90 minutes from the city, paid in cash. No lease, no phone. When officers entered, she didn't resist. She sat on the edge of the bed, brushing a baby doll's hair, her face pale and sunken. I kept him safe, she whispered as they handcuffed her. He was mine. They said I lost him, but I didn't. He needed someone. So I stayed. At first, police assumed she was referring to the doll, until they searched the basement. The stairs led to a narrow, low-ceilinged hallway. The walls were painted sky blue, covered in stickers, balloons, stars, smiling clouds. At the end was a single door, soundproof. Inside a crib, white, clean, rocking slightly. Inside the crib lay Noah, not alive, not breathing, not forgotten. His tiny body was preserved as if sleeping, wrapped in the same hospital-issued blanket from the night he died. No signs of trauma, no violence, just stillness, frozen in time. Emily collapsed when they told her. Mark vomited on the kitchen floor. The grief was not sudden, it had never left, but now it came with claws. Because this time it wasn't confusion or tragedy, it was theft. A horror made from hands, not fate. Ellen's trial never happened. She was declared unfit, diagnosed with delusional disorder, complicated grief syndrome, and psychosis stemming from the loss of her own child 20 years ago. Her medical record revealed she'd been hospitalized twice before. Red flags, ignored. The hospital suspended everyone involved in the record-keeping that night. Lawsuits followed. Policies were rewritten. But none of that mattered to Emily and Mark. What mattered was the small white casket, now filled properly. What mattered was the dirt, turned for the second time, but finally with purpose. They buried Noah again, this time, with his real name etched in stone, with music, with family, with truth. Emily placed the hospital blanket in the coffin beside him. Even though police had tagged it for evidence, he deserves it, she told them. No one objected. Mark delivered a eulogy that was not poetic but real. I held him once when he was born. I held him again when they gave him back. There was too much time between. Shadow stood beside them, not digging, not pacing, just still, just present. When the final shovel of dirt was placed, he lowered his head and rested it gently against the soil. Emily wept openly, not like before, not in confusion or anger, but in release and terrible. Broken release that night. Their home was quiet. Mark closed the nursery door. Emily washed her hands twice before sitting down. Neither of them spoke. Shadow walked through the hallway, sniffed the closed door, and then slowly lay down outside of it. He did not whimper. He did not stir. He simply watched, as if daring the silence to try again. The world outside tried to move on before they were ready. Flowers arrived from people they hadn't spoken to in years. An old professor sent a card with a verse neither of them understood. The hospital offered condolences wrapped in sterile language and a formal invitation to join a grief support group that met every Thursday at 6. But for Emily, 6 o'clock had already been claimed. That was Shadow's hour. Every morning, he still rose before the sun and walked to the front door, sitting patiently until someone opened it, and then he would vanish down the street, silent as ever at first. Emily had assumed that his ritual would end once Noah was finally, truly laid to rest. But it didn't. If anything, it became more deliberate. Mark watched from the kitchen window, coffee cooling in his hands, as the black silhouette of the German shepherd disappeared into the mist. He wanted to follow him again. He wanted to believe that there was still something waiting to be unearthed, something not yet broken. But Emily said no. Let him do what he needs to do, she said quietly, not looking up from the small white baby sock she was holding. One of the last clean pieces of Noah's clothing that hadn't been collected as evidence. He knows more than we do. They lived in a strange rhythm now, their conversations brief but soft, like the way people speak in hospitals at night. Sometimes Mark would wake and find Emily already in the nursery, sitting in the rocking chair, staring at the wall where a faded outline of a removed mobile lingered like a scar. She didn't cry much. Instead, her grief had fossilized into a kind of haunted stillness, as if she were waiting for someone to return a missing chapter of her life story. And Mark, who had always found comfort in solutions, in structure, in the clean logic of anatomy and diagnosis, now found himself adrift in a world that refused to offer him anything tidy. He started researching Ellen Voss not as a physician, but as a man trying to understand how someone could cross the line between sorrow and delusion so completely. What he found unsettled him. Ellen had been reprimanded twice during her career for administrative discrepancies, once for an unfiled medication chart and once for improperly logged infant records. She had transferred hospitals 3 times in 5 years. Each transfer involved some quiet notation of personal issues or recommended counseling. Yet she was never flagged, never barred, never treated as dangerous. He found an old article tucked deep in the archives of a medical newsletter, an anonymous essay written by a nurse describing phantom motherhood. A psychological response sometimes found in women who had lost children but continued to act as though they were still alive, feeding empty bottles, keeping nurseries, singing lullabies to silence. Mark closed his laptop and stared at the reflection of his own face on the screen. He looked older, not in the way time ages a man, but in the way sorrow does, pulling at the edges, hollowing the cheeks, dimming the eyes from within. That night, Emily asked him, "Do you think she thought she was doing the right thing?" Mark didn't answer right away. He thought of the soundproof room, the baby drawings, the blanket wrapped so perfectly. He thought of Ellen's face when she was arrested, not angry, not frightened, but vacant, like a woman caught in a dream she couldn't escape. "I think she believed she saved him," he finally said. Emily didn't respond, but her fingers curled around the sock in her lap until her knuckles turned white. Meanwhile, Shadow's behavior began to shift. He still left at 6, still returned at dusk. But one afternoon, he came back with a torn piece of paper in his mouth, yellowed, smudged, clearly dragged through dirt. Emily took it from him gently and unfolded it. It was a photograph, old, blurry, probably taken with a disposable camera. A young woman, barely 20, standing in front of a hospital sign. She held a baby in her arms. The baby was swaddled in a familiar blanket. On the back of the photo, in faint pencil, "Evie, my light." Emily's throat closed. Mark examined the photo with clinical detachment, but even he couldn't deny the familiarity of the blanket pattern, the shape of the building behind the girl, the way the baby's face was turned just slightly away, too conveniently to identify. "Where did he get this?" Mark asked. Emily looked at Shadow, who was now lying in the hallway, watching them both. "I don't know," she whispered, "but I think he's trying to tell us something." The next morning, Mark followed Shadow again. This time, the dog didn't go to the cemetery. Instead, he led him to the woods beyond Rosewood. Not deep into the trees, just past the clearing where broken headstones lay forgotten. There, beneath a rotten log, was a box, weathered, small. Inside it, more photos, letters, notes scribbled in looping handwriting that wavered between reality and fantasy. He cried today. I held him until the stars blinked out. They won't take him back. He's mine now. I fixed what they broke. His name is not Noah, it's Eli. My Eli. I chose it. He smiled for me. Mark felt the hairs on his neck rise. He closed the box and carried it home in silence. Emily read every note that night, her expression unreadable. She renamed him. She murmured. She gave him a whole other life. Mark didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Shadow sat by the fireplace, eyes on the flames, tail still. The next day, police were informed. The items were submitted as evidence, and the case file on Ellen Voss thickened with the weight of obsession. But for Emily and Mark, the discovery wasn't about justice, it was about understanding, and maybe, in a strange and terrible way, closure. That night, as they turned off the lights and prepared for sleep, Emily whispered into the darkness, I don't know what scares me more, that she stole him because she was insane or because she really thought she was saving him. Mark reached across the bed, his fingers finding hers. It doesn't matter now, he said. We have him back, and we let him go the right way. But in the hallway, Shadow still stood by the nursery door, watching, waiting, as if some part of him still wasn't convinced, as if something else had yet to be uncovered. The days that followed settled into a strange kind of rhythm, quiet but taut, like the moments before a thunderstorm when the air thickens and the wind holds its breath. Emily and Mark moved through their house like people walking on ice, careful, deliberate, never speaking too loudly, never closing a door too hard. The nursery remained untouched, still filled with the soft remnants of the life they had tried to build, a crib that smelled faintly of baby powder, a rocking chair that still creaked when no one sat in it, walls painted in a blue so gentle it almost hurt to look at. Mark started working again. Not full-time, but enough to put on the illusion of normalcy. His colleagues welcomed him with hollow eyes and hesitant nods, the kind of sympathy that never quite knows where to land. They didn't ask questions, not out of respect, but because the story had made its way through every hallway, every break room, every email thread. Everyone knew. They all knew about the coffin, about the nurse, about the baby. Emily stayed home. She didn't return to teaching. She didn't call her mother back. She spent her morning staring out the window, a mug of cold coffee untouched in her hands, watching the sidewalk where Shadow would disappear each day at 6:00 a.m. and return like clockwork at dusk. It had become a ritual now, one she didn't interfere with. Not because she was afraid, but because it felt sacred, an instinct older than logic, older than grief. One afternoon, Shadow didn't return on time. Emily noticed first, her fingers tightening around the windowsill as the sky darkened. Mark, home early from a half-day shift, found her standing there, unmoving. Is he late? He asked gently. She nodded. By an hour. They waited together in the silence, neither speaking. Then, just as the last light began to fade, Shadow appeared, trotting slowly up the sidewalk, something clenched gently between his teeth. Mark stepped onto the porch as Shadow approached, lowering his head to release the object, a small, cloth-bound journal, stained and worn with age. Emily picked it up carefully, the cover soft from handling. The pages curled at the edges. Inside, the handwriting was small, slanted, unmistakably female. Ellen Voss. The entries began with joy. Eli giggled today. The way he looks at me, I swear he knows. His hair is growing and dark, like his father's. He sleeps best when I sing the stars down. But soon, the tone shifted. They're coming. I can feel it. They'll try to take him. He cries when I say your name. He knows you're not real. I told him about heaven today, told him he came back for me. Emily closed the book slowly, her hands trembling. She felt sick, but not with rage, with sorrow, with a grief that wasn't hers but somehow bled into her bones. She really believed he was her son. She whispered. Mark stood behind her, reading over her shoulder, or she couldn't bear to believe otherwise. The next day, police added the journal to the case file. A detective came by, asking questions again, softer this time, more like a priest than an officer. He offered them updates on Ellen's condition. She was stable, medicated, monitored, but not improving. She didn't speak anymore, not since the day they took Noah's body from her home. She sat in her room at the facility, staring out the window, mouth parted, eyes unblinking. Sometimes she hummed a lullaby that no one could quite identify. "She's lost in there," the detective said as he left. "Might have been lost for a long time before you ever met her that night." Emily couldn't sleep. She walked the halls in bare feet, pausing at the nursery door before stepping inside. The air was still. She turned on the lamp. The soft yellow glow made everything look warm again, if only for a moment. She picked up one of Noah's plush toys and held it close, breathing in the faint scent that hadn't yet disappeared. Behind her, she heard a low, soft thud. Turning, she saw Shadow sitting in the doorway, watching her. She knelt and opened her arms. He approached slowly, pressed his forehead into her chest, and for the first time in weeks, Emily cried not just from pain, but from the hollow space that comes after pain, the part no one tells you about. Mark found them that way hours later, curled together on the nursery floor, the past and the present tangled in silence. The following morning, they buried the journal, not in the backyard, not in a cemetery, but in the woods beyond Rosewood, near the place Shadow had first uncovered the box of Ellen's letters. Mark dug the hole while Emily wrapped the journal in a clean cloth. "Why here?" he asked quietly. "Because she never got to bury her own," Emily replied. "This is the only grave she'll ever visit, even if it's only in her mind." When the earth was packed again, Shadow circled it once, then sat beside it, as still as stone. Emily reached down and placed a single toy rattle on top, a plastic crescent moon that had once hung above Noah's crib. "Let it rest," she said. Mark took her hand. Let all of it rest, for the first time in a long time. The walk home felt lighter, not healed, but bearable. Days later, a letter arrived, handwritten, no return address. Just their names in neat block print. Inside was a photograph of Noah, cradled in Ellen's arms, taken sometime during the missing hours. He was sleeping, peaceful, unaware. On the back of the photo, one sentence: "I only wanted to love him too." Emily didn't tear the photo up. She didn't burn it. She placed it inside a small frame and tucked it into the bottom drawer of her bedside table. Not to honor Ellen, but to remind herself that grief, when left to rot, can become a thief. That some stories don't have villains, just broken people who make terrible choices, trying to fix a wound the world refuses to see. The next time Shadow left at 6:00 a.m., Emily didn't watch from the window. She didn't check the time. She simply trusted that wherever he went, it was necessary. That he, too, was still trying to make sense of a world that had never played fair. That he, too, carried the weight of a boy who had smiled once in his sleep and then disappeared into the darkest parts of memory. And when he returned that night, there was no object in his mouth, no paper, no journal. He walked straight into the nursery, lay beneath the crib, and slept. For the first time since Noah had gone, he dreamed. The first thing Emily noticed that morning was the absence of sound. No faint thump of Shadow's paws down the hall. No soft jingle of his collar. No scratch at the door at 5:58 a.m. The house was quiet, not the uneasy, heavy silence that had followed Noah's death, but a silence that felt strange in a different way, like something had slipped through the cracks in the world during the night. She sat up slowly, blinking into the pale gray light filtering through the curtains, her ears straining for the familiar rhythm of Shadow's morning departure. Nothing. At first she thought maybe he had slept in, just this once. Maybe his old legs had finally decided to rest. But when she slipped into the hallway, heart already uneasy, and looked toward the nursery door, she saw it was open. Shadow was not there. She walked through every room, called his name softly, checked the kitchen, the backyard, the porch, but there was no sign of him. Mark stirred as she passed the bedroom again, eyes squinting open. "What is it?" he asked groggily. "It's Shadow," Emily said. "He's gone." The two words landed like stones in the quiet. Mark sat up fast, his body reacting before his thoughts caught up. Gone where Emily shook her head. He didn't wait at the door. He didn't go to the cemetery. "I don't think he left through the usual way at all. Mark was already pulling on a sweater, his jaw tightening. Maybe he's just outside. You know how he is. Maybe he followed a scent. But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. They searched the neighborhood for hours, asked neighbors, checked every usual place, Rosewood Cemetery, the woods, the quiet path behind the playground where he sometimes wandered. But nothing. No tracks, no prints, no torn cloth or signs of struggle. Shadow had vanished. That night, the house felt unfamiliar, like the soul of it had gone missing. The floors creaked differently. The wind pressed harder against the windows. The rocking chair in the nursery tilted slightly on its own, swaying gently without a breeze. Emily stood in the doorway for a long time, watching that quiet movement, before stepping inside and sitting on the floor, her back against the crib. She closed her eyes. He knew something. She whispered, something he didn't show us. Mark knelt beside her. We found everything. The grave, the journal, the letters. What else could there be? Emily shook her head. It's not about finding more. It's about him letting go. Mark wanted to argue, to say something that would tether them to logic. But instead he reached forward and took her hand. That night he dreamed of Shadow, not as he was in recent weeks, tired and solemn, but young again, strong and full of light. In the dream, the dog was standing at the edge of the woods, staring into a fog that moved like breath. When Mark called his name, Shadow turned once, met his eyes, and then walked forward into the mist, into the silence, into whatever waited beyond. In the morning, the dream felt so vivid that Mark found himself looking toward the back fence, half expecting a black figure to appear through the trees, but the yard remained empty. The days passed slowly after that. Each morning, Emily opened the front door at 6, not because she expected him to be there, but because something inside her needed that ritual, that pause, that acknowledgement of what had once been. And then, exactly 2 weeks after Shadow disappeared, a package arrived, no return address, just their names. Inside, carefully wrapped in layers of soft cloth, was a collar, Shadow's collar. The tag was intact, no blood, no dirt, no sign of harm, just him. Attached to the tag was a note. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but careful. He stayed with her. It read, at the end, he didn't leave her alone. Emily's hands trembled. She passed the note to Mark. He read it 3 times, each word pressing harder into his chest. What does it mean? He whispered. Emily's eyes filled, but not with fear, with something deeper. He went back to her. She said, to Ellen. Somehow, he found her. Mark stared at the note again. But she's in the facility. How would he? He stopped. The logic didn't matter. What mattered was the message. Shadow had chosen where to spend his final hours, not under the crib, not beside their bed, but at the side of the woman who had broken everything, perhaps because she, too, was broken beyond repair. Perhaps because, in some strange, silent way, she had loved Noah too. Later that afternoon, Emily called the facility where Ellen was being treated. After several transfers and an awkward pause, a quiet-voiced nurse told her that Ellen had passed away 2 nights before. Peacefully, no pain. She hadn't spoken in days, but the night she died, she had reached out one last time, as if stroking something that wasn't there. We thought she was reliving something, the nurse said, but it wasn't until the next morning that we found a dog curled up outside her window. He was gone by the time we opened the door. Emily hung up the phone with tears streaking her cheeks, clutching the collar in her hands like a sacred object. That evening, they buried it in the woods, the same place they'd buried Ellen's journal. The earth was soft, and the air still carried the warmth of a fading sun. Mark dug the hole. Emily lowered the collar in, and together, they covered it with earth. No prayers, no speeches, just quiet, just presence, just truth. A week later, Emily planted a tree there, a dogwood, delicate and white, for the last guardian, she said. Mark nodded, placing a small stone beside the roots. And the last secret. Seasons shifted, the grief softened, never disappeared, but settled, like dust on a windowsill, always there, but no longer choking. The nursery remained, not frozen, but honored. Sometimes Emily sat there with a book. Sometimes Mark stood by the crib and whispered stories. And sometimes, when the wind moved just right, the rocking chair creaked on its own, and they liked to believe that maybe, just maybe, something was still watching over them. On Noah's birthday, they lit a single candle and placed it on the windowsill. They didn't sing, they didn't speak. They just stood together, hand in hand, watching the flame flicker, knowing that somewhere beyond the trees, beyond memory, beyond everything explainable, a black dog had kept watch until his final breath, not out of duty, but love. And love, Emily thought, was the one thing that never really disappeared. It just waited, quietly. In the last place you left it,